The wind howled across the Montana territory like the voice of death itself, carrying snow so thick it turned day into night. It was December 1870, and Sarah Mitchell stood at her cabin window, watching the storm gather strength over the distant peaks. Her hand rested on her swollen belly, feeling the baby move restlessly inside her. She was 8 months along, and this child would be her first. Sarah had come to Montana 3 years earlier as a male order bride, leaving behind the gentle hills of Ohio for the harsh beauty of the frontier. She had been 19 then, full of dreams about building a life in the untamed West. Thomas Mitchell had seemed like a good man from his letters, honest, hard-working, and kind. When she stepped off the stagecoach in Helena, he had been waiting with wildflowers in his rough hands and genuine warmth in his brown eyes. Their courtship had been brief but tender. Thomas owned 160 acres of good grazing land in a valley 30 miles from the nearest settlement. He had built the cabin himself, cutting every log from the surrounding pine forest, chinkling the gaps with mud and moss to keep out the bitter winter winds. It wasn't much to look at. 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and windows that Thomas had traded a season's worth of pelts to acquire. But it was theirs. Sarah had learned to love the isolation. She tended a small garden in the summer, preserved meat and vegetables for the long winters, and helped Thomas with the cattle. The work was harder than anything she had known in Ohio, but it was honest work. Her hands had grown calloused, her arms strong from hauling water and splitting kindling. She had become a different woman out here, tougher, more self-reliant, shaped by the demands of frontier life. But nothing had prepared her for this pregnancy. The nearest doctor was in Helena, a 4-day ride in good weather. The closest neighbor, old Henrik Larson, lived 15 miles south near Willow Creek. Sarah had planned to travel to Helena when her time came, but the baby seemed determined to arrive early. For the past week, she had felt the child settling lower, the pressure in her back increasing with each passing day. Thomas had been reluctant to leave her alone, but they were desperately low on supplies. The early winter had been brutal, with temperatures dropping to 40 below zero for days at a time. Their stores of flour, coffee, and salt pork were nearly exhausted, and Thomas needed ammunition for hunting. The trip to Copper Creek couldn't be delayed any longer. "I'll be back in 2 days," he had promised that morning, loading supplies onto their sturdy Mustang. "3 at most if the weather turns bad. You'll be fine, Sarah. The baby's not due for another month." Sarah had nodded and kissed him goodbye, but a cold knot of worry had settled in her stomach. The sky had looked ominous even then, with high, thin clouds that old-timers said meant heavy snow was coming. The wind had carried a bitter edge that made the cattle restless and sent the chickens huddling in their coop. Her husband Thomas had left that morning for Copper Creek, a 2-day ride to collect supplies before the worst of winter set in. He had kissed her goodbye, promising to return before the storm hit full force. But the weather had other plans. The blizzard arrived 6 hours early, turning the world into a whirling wall of white death. Sarah pressed her face to the frost, covered glass, and saw nothing but snow. The flakes weren't the gentle, lazy snowfall of an Ohio winter. These were hard, driving pellets of ice that struck the windows like bullets. The wind screamed around the cabin, rattling the wooden shutters and sending ice crystals through every crack in the walls. She pulled her wool shawl tighter, the one her mother had knitted for her wedding, and fed more wood to the fire. The flames danced and flickered, casting nervous shadows on the log walls. Sarah had learned to read the moods of their fireplace during her 3 years in Montana. Tonight, it struggled against the downdrafts created by the howling wind. She adjusted the damper and added another split of seasoned pine, watching the flames leap higher. The cabin had been Thomas's pride when he first brought her here. He had spent 2 summers building it, selecting each log carefully, notching them with the precision of a craftsman. The foundation was built on stones hauled from the creek bed, raising the structure high enough to prevent flooding during spring thaw. The roof was steep to shed snow, and the walls were thick enough to keep out the worst of winter's fury. But as the storm intensified, Sarah began to notice things she had never paid attention to before. The way the wind found every small gap between the logs, sending cold fingers of air across the room. The subtle creaking of the timbers as they flexed under the pressure of the gale. The tremor that ran through the floor when particularly strong gusts struck the structure. By evening, the cabin had grown dangerously cold. Despite the blazing fire, the temperature inside had dropped so low that Sarah's breath showed white in the air. She dragged their feather mattress from the bedroom and arranged it near the hearth, creating a small warm zone where she could rest. The wind found every weakness in Thomas's construction, and ice began forming on the inside of the windows. She wrapped herself in every blanket they owned, the wool ones from Ohio, the buffalo hide Thomas had traded for in Helena, the colorful quilt her sister had sent as a wedding gift. The baby moved restlessly in her womb, as if sensing the danger that surrounded them. Sarah placed both hands on her belly and spoke to the unborn child. "Your papa will be home soon," she whispered, though fear gnawed at her heart like a hungry animal. "He is strong and smart. He knows these mountains better than anyone. He is probably holed up in some line shack, waiting for the storm to pass." But as the hours crawled by and the storm grew fiercer, Sarah began to accept a terrible truth. Thomas was trapped somewhere in that white hell, fighting for his own life. The temperature had dropped so low that exposed skin would freeze in minutes. No man could survive long in this kind of weather, not even one as experienced as her husband. She was alone, heavily pregnant, and running out of time. The first pain hit her just after midnight. Sarah gasped and doubled over, clutching her belly as a contraction tore through her like a knife blade. The sensation was unlike anything she had experienced. A deep, grinding pressure that seemed to squeeze her entire body in an iron vise. It passed after 30 seconds, leaving her breathless and shaking. "No," she whispered to the empty cabin. "Not now. Please, not now." But the baby had its own schedule. Another contraction followed 20 minutes later, stronger than the first. Sarah gripped the edge of their handmade table, the one Thomas had crafted from a single massive pine, and breathed through the pain the way her mother had taught her. "Count to 10. Breathe slowly. Let the pain wash over you without fighting it." Outside, the wind shrieked like a banshee and snow piled higher against the windows. The storm had transformed the familiar landscape into an alien world. The barn, which stood only 50 yards from the cabin, had completely disappeared in the whirling white. The woodpile that Thomas had so carefully stacked was now just a snow-covered mound. Even the old cottonwood tree by the creek, a landmark visible from miles away, had vanished into the blizzard. The cabin felt smaller with each passing hour, as if the storm was slowly crushing it. Sarah could hear the weight of accumulating snow on the roof, a subtle creaking and groaning that she had never noticed before. The sound filled her with dread. Montana blizzards had been known to collapse buildings under the sheer weight of snow. What would happen to her baby if the roof gave way? She needed help. She needed Thomas. She needed anyone, but there was no one. The nearest neighbor was 15 miles away through terrain that was treacherous, even in good weather. No one would venture out in a storm like this. She was as alone as a human being could be, facing the most dangerous experience of her life, without a soul to help her. The pains came closer together as the night wore on. Sarah paced the small cabin, her hand pressed to her lower back where a constant ache had settled. She tried to distract herself by tending to small tasks, banking the fire, checking the water barrel, organizing the medical supplies she had prepared weeks ago for the birth. But every few minutes, another contraction would double her over, stronger and longer than the last. By 3 in the morning, the contractions were coming every 15 minutes. Sarah knew from talking to other frontier women that she still had hours to go, but the intensity frightened her. Each pain felt like it might tear her apart. She had attended one birth back in Ohio, helping a neighbor woman deliver her 4th child. But that had been in a warm house with an experienced midwife present, hot water always ready, and people to help if something went wrong. This was different. This was life stripped down to its most basic elements. A woman, a baby, and the primal struggle for survival. The fire burned low, and when Sarah tried to add more wood, another contraction doubled her over. The logs scattered across the floor, and the flames began to die. Panic fluttered in her chest as she watched the fire dwindle. Without it, they would both freeze to death within hours. Fighting through the pain, Sarah managed to gather the scattered wood and coax the flames back to life. But the effort left her exhausted, and she could feel her strength ebbing with each contraction. The baby was coming whether she was ready or not, and she had to find a way to deliver it safely in conditions that would challenge even an experienced doctor. Cold crept into the cabin like a living thing. The wind found every tiny gap in the log walls, carrying ice crystals that stung her face and hands. Sarah's breath turned to fog, and despite the fire, the temperature continued to drop. She could feel the cold seeping through the floorboards, rising from the ground that was frozen solid beneath the cabin. She gathered her supplies, clean rags torn from their best sheets, a sharp knife sterilized in the fire, a pot of water kept warm by the hearth. Everything her mother and the other women had told her she would need, but their advice seemed woefully inadequate now. Faced with the reality of giving birth alone in a freezing cabin while a blizzard tried to bury them alive, dawn brought no relief. If anything, the storm had intensified during the night. The wind howled with a voice that seemed almost human, rising and falling in cadences that reminded Sarah of screaming. Snow had piled so high against the windows that only a dim gray light filtered through, creating an eerie twilight inside the cabin. Sarah's contractions were now only minutes apart, each one longer and more intense than the last. She had prepared a small area near the fire with clean cloths and basins of warm water, but everything felt impossibly difficult. Her hands shook from cold and fear. Her legs trembled with exhaustion. The baby seemed to sense her distress, moving frantically in her womb as if trying to escape the chaos of the outside world. She tried to eat something to keep up her strength, but her stomach rebelled against food. The smell of the salt pork made her nauseous, and even water was hard to keep down. Her body was preparing for the marathon of labor, shutting down everything non-essential and focusing all its energy on the monumental task ahead. Then the worst possible thing happened. Around noon on the first day, a massive gust of wind slammed into the cabin with the force of a freight train. The entire structure shuddered like a living thing, and Sarah heard a terrible cracking sound from above. She looked up just as a section of the roof gave way, sending snow and freezing air pouring into her sanctuary. The collapse was catastrophic. A section of roof about 4 feet square simply caved in, unable to bear the weight of snow that had been accumulating for hours. The failure happened in slow motion. First a sag in the ceiling, then a groaning of timbers, then a sudden crash as wood, bark shingles, and tons of snow came crashing down. Fire hissed and died instantly, killed by the cascade of snow and ice. Darkness swallowed the cabin except for the eerie gray light filtering through the gaping hole in the roof. The temperature plummeted immediately, and Sarah's world became a nightmare of cold, pain, and primal fear. She stumbled away from the collapsed area, clutching her belly as another contraction seized her. The baby was coming faster now, spurred by the stress and trauma. She could feel the child moving down, positioning itself for birth whether conditions were suitable or not. Snow continued to pour through the broken roof, and the wind carried the promise of death. Within minutes, a drift began forming in the center of the cabin's main room. The carefully maintained warmth of 3 years was being sucked away into the howling Montana night. Sarah gathered every blanket, every piece of cloth she could find, and dragged them to the far corner of the cabin, the only area still protected from the elements. Her movements were clumsy and desperate, hampered by the increasing frequency of contractions and the bitter cold that numbed her fingers and toes. She managed to light a candle with trembling hands, its tiny flame providing the only warmth in the frozen hell her home had become. The small light barely pushed back the darkness, creating a tiny circle of visibility in what had once been her safe haven. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, Sarah felt something else rising in her chest, a fierce determination that surprised her with its intensity. She was Thomas Mitchell's wife, a woman who had chosen to make her life on the frontier. She had survived prairie fires, wolf attacks, and winters that would have killed someone less prepared. She would not let this storm defeat her. The baby was coming whether she was ready or not, and she would find a way to bring this child safely into the world. Sarah had no choice but to deliver her child alone, in the dark, in the cold, while a blizzard tried to bury them alive. She arranged her makeshift delivery area in the protected corner, using overturned furniture to create windbreaks against the drafts. The single candle provided minimal light, but it was better than complete darkness. Her water broke just as evening fell on the first day, a warm rush that was almost welcome in the bitter cold. The contractions immediately intensified, coming now in waves that barely gave her time to breathe between them. Sarah bit down on a leather strap, one of Thomas's old bridles, to keep from screaming. In this wilderness, the sound of a woman in distress might attract predators far more dangerous than the storm. The pain was unlike anything she had ever imagined. It consumed her entire body, starting deep in her back and radiating outward until every muscle, every nerve, every fiber of her being was focused on the monumental task of bringing forth life. She had thought she understood suffering. The ache of hard work, the bite of winter cold, the gnawing of hunger during lean times. But this was different. This was pain with purpose. Pain that meant creation rather than destruction. Hours passed in a blur of agony and effort. Sarah's world narrowed to the space between contractions, each brief respite a moment to gather strength for the next wave of pain. The candle burned down to a stub, and she lit another with shaking hands, then another. The small flames were all that stood between them and complete darkness. Around midnight, Sarah began to feel the urge to push. The sensation was overwhelming, primal, impossible to resist. Her body took over, driven by instincts older than civilization. She braced herself against the wall and bore down, every muscle in her body working toward a single goal. The effort was exhausting. Between pushes, Sarah rested her head against the cold log wall and tried to conserve her strength. She could hear the storm raging outside, unchanged in its fury. Snow continued to drift through the broken roof, and the temperature had dropped so low that her breath formed instant clouds in the candlelight. But something else was happening too. As the hours passed, Sarah began to feel a strange sense of connection with all the women who had come before her. Pioneer mothers who had given birth in covered wagons on the Oregon Trail, Indian women who had delivered their children in the wilderness, her own grandmother, who had borne 9 children on a hardscrabble farm in Pennsylvania. They had all faced this same ancient challenge, this fundamental test of will and endurance. The knowledge gave her strength. She was part of an unbroken chain of mothers stretching back to the dawn of humanity. Women who had faced impossible odds and somehow found the courage to bring new life into the world. If they could do it, so could she. Then, in the early hours of the second day, something changed. Sarah felt the baby's head crowning, and despite the impossible circumstances, a surge of fierce joy filled her heart. This child was fighting just as hard as she was, determined to survive against all odds. "Come on, little one," she whispered through gritted teeth. "You are almost here, just a little more." With a final, desperate push that seemed to come from the very core of her being, Sarah brought her daughter into the world. The baby slid out in a rush of warmth and fluid, tiny and perfect and utterly silent. For one terrible moment, Sarah thought she was too late, that the cold had already claimed her child. The baby was small and blue, tinged, covered in blood and birth fluid, lying motionless in her trembling hands. Terror clutched at Sarah's heart. Had she endured all of this only to lose her child in the final moments? Then she remembered what the midwife back in Ohio had taught her. She cleared the baby's nose and mouth with her finger, then rubbed the tiny chest vigorously with a clean cloth. The motion was awkward in the dim candlelight, but she persisted, refusing to give up. Suddenly, the baby gasped. a small, desperate sound that was the most beautiful thing Sarah had ever heard. The chest rose and fell, then rose again. Then came a thin, wavering cry that filled the frozen cabin with the sound of life, triumphant. Oh, Sarah sobbed, pulling her daughter against her chest. Oh, my beautiful girl. The baby was tiny, probably not more than 5 pounds, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that seemed far too wise for such a small face. When those eyes opened and looked up at Sarah for the first time, something fundamental shifted in the universe. This was her child. Her daughter, the most precious thing she had ever created. She wrapped the baby in every warm thing she could find. Soft flannel shirts, wool stockings, the rabbit fur muff her mother had given her. The child stopped crying and settled against Sarah's skin, finding warmth and comfort in the contact. "Hello, little one," Sarah whispered, tears freezing on her cheeks in the bitter air. "I am your mama, and we're going to be just fine, you and me." But even as she spoke the words, Sarah knew their ordeal was far from over. The storm showed no signs of abating, and the cabin offered little protection now, with its gaping roof and dwindling fuel supply. She had maybe hours before the cold claimed them both, and she was weak from blood loss and exhaustion. That is when she heard the first howl. The sound drifted across the valley like something from a nightmare, long, mournful, and far too close for comfort. Sarah's blood turned to ice as she recognized the call of wolves. They were pack hunters, intelligent and persistent, and they had caught the scent of blood on the wind. She clutched her daughter tighter and tried to stay perfectly still, but the baby was beginning to fuss again. The child was hungry and cold, despite Sarah's efforts to keep her warm. The fussing turned to crying. Thin, high-pitched wails that seemed to pierce the night like a beacon for every predator within miles. Through the broken roof, Sarah could see movement in the swirling snow. Dark shapes circled the cabin, just beyond the reach of her flickering candlelight. Yellow eyes reflected the tiny flame, and she could hear the soft pad of paws on snow as the pack grew bolder. Sarah had seen wolf tracks around their property before, but Thomas had always been there with his rifle. Now she was alone, wounded, and responsible for protecting the most helpless creature imaginable. The kitchen knife she had used to cut the umbilical cord was her only weapon, and she was far too weak to fight off a determined pack. The wolves seemed to sense her vulnerability. Their howls grew closer and more frequent, and Sarah could hear them scratching at the walls of the cabin, testing for weaknesses. They were hungry and desperate, driven to unusual boldness by the harsh winter and the promising scent of blood. As the second night deepened, the pack grew more aggressive. Sarah heard them on the roof, their claws scrabbling against the remaining shingles. One of them found the hole and peered down into the cabin, its eyes glowing like coals in the candlelight. Sarah grabbed a piece of burning wood from her small fire and thrust it upward. The wolf yelped and retreated, but others took its place. They were testing her, learning her capabilities, waiting for her strength to fail. The baby continued to cry, her small voice echoing off the log walls. Sarah tried everything she could think of to quiet the child, rocking, humming, even offering her finger to suck. But the baby was hungry for milk she couldn't yet provide, and cold despite all the layers of clothing and blankets. By dawn of the third day, Sarah was beginning to hallucinate from exhaustion and blood loss. She saw faces in the shadows. Her mother, her sister, women she had known back in Ohio. They seemed to be encouraging her, telling her to hold on just a little longer. But she also saw darker shapes, figures that beckoned her toward rest and peace, and an end to the struggle. The wolves had grown bolder during the night. One of them had actually entered the cabin through the broken roof, forcing Sarah to drive it away with her makeshift torch. The effort had cost her precious strength, and her fire was burning dangerously low. She was down to her last candle, and when it burned out, they would be left in complete darkness. The temperature in the cabin had dropped so low that she could see ice crystals forming in the air with each breath. The baby had grown listless, conserving energy, her cries becoming weaker and less frequent. Sarah knew they were both dying. The cold was winning, sapping their strength by degrees. She held her daughter close and began to sing old hymns her mother had taught her, lullabies passed down through generations of women. If they were going to die, at least they would go peacefully, surrounded by love and music. That is when she heard it. Faint at first, barely audible over the howling wind, the sound of horses whinnying and men's voices calling her name. Sarah thought it might be another hallucination, but the sounds grew stronger and closer. "Here!" she screamed with the last of her strength, her voice cracking from thirst and cold. "We're here in the cabin!" The wolves scattered as torchlight filled the clearing around the collapsed cabin. Sarah heard Thomas's voice above all the others, raw with emotion and desperate urgency. Then the search party was digging through the snow-blocked door, and Thomas himself was climbing through the broken roof, his face wild with relief and terror. "Sarah." He dropped to his knees beside her, taking in the scene, the blood, the baby, the signs of the wolf siege. "My God in heaven, what happened here?" Sarah collapsed into his arms, finally allowing herself to feel safe after 3 days of fighting for their lives. Her strength abandoned her all at once, and she could barely speak through her chattering teeth. "She is alive," she whispered, pressing their daughter into his trembling hands. "We both are, Thomas. Meet your daughter." Thomas looked down at the tiny bundle. This miraculous child who had been born into a nightmare and survived through sheer force of will and her mother's fierce love. The baby opened her dark eyes and looked at her father for the first time, and something broke inside his chest, relief so profound it was almost painful. "What is her name?" he asked through tears, his voice thick with emotion. Sarah smiled, thinking of the 3 days of hell they had endured, of the moments when death had seemed certain, of the wolves and the cold and the instant when she had been ready to sacrifice everything for this small life. "Hope," she said without hesitation. "Her name is Hope." The rescue party, Thomas and 3 neighbors who had risked their own lives to search for her, wrapped Sarah and the baby in warm furs and carried them to safety. Dr. Henley from Copper Creek examined them both and declared it a miracle they had survived. Sarah was severely weakened by blood loss and exposure, but she would recover. The baby, despite being born a month early in the worst possible conditions, was remarkably healthy. Later, they would learn that Thomas had been trapped in Copper Creek by the storm, unable to leave for 3 days while the blizzard raged. He had gathered the search party the moment the weather cleared enough to travel, knowing that his wife and unborn child were facing mortal danger. The guilt of leaving her alone would haunt him for months, though Sarah assured him there was nothing else he could have done. They rebuilt the cabin that spring, this time with a reinforced roof designed to withstand the heaviest snow loads. Thomas installed better windows and improved the chinking between the logs. He also built a storm shelter, a small, well-insulated room stocked with supplies where his family could ride out future emergencies. But the most important change was in Sarah herself. The 3 days of terror had transformed her from a gentle Ohio farm girl into something harder and more resilient. She had looked death in the face and refused to blink. She had protected her child against impossible odds and emerged victorious. Hope grew up to be as fierce and determined as the mother who had fought death itself to bring her into the world. She learned to ride before she could properly walk, could track game through the forest by the time she was 10, and never showed fear of the wilderness that had nearly claimed her life. The story of her birth became family legend, told and retold around the fireplace on winter nights. When Hope was old enough to understand, Sarah would take her to the spot where the old cabin had stood and tell her the full story, about the blizzard that had tried to bury them, about the roof that collapsed and the wolves that circled in the darkness, about the moment when a gentle woman became a warrior to protect her child. "You were born into a storm," Sarah would tell her daughter, "but you came through it stronger because of what you endured. Remember that when life gets hard, remember that you are the daughter of a woman who refused to give up, even when everything seemed lost." Hope would nod solemnly, understanding even as a child that she carried something special inside her, a legacy of courage that no storm could ever destroy. She would need that strength in the years to come as the frontier tested her family in new ways and the changing world brought fresh challenges. The broken cabin still stands in that Montana valley, though it is little more than a pile of weathered logs now. Locals say that on quiet winter nights, when the wind is just right and the snow falls soft and steady, you can still hear the echo of a baby's first cry, the sound of hope being born in the darkest hour when a mother's love proves stronger than death itself. Sarah Mitchell lived to be 87, long enough to see Montana become a state and the frontier she had known transformed by railroads and cities. She never spoke much about those 3 days in the blizzard, but those who knew her well could see the steel beneath her gentle exterior. She had been tested by the worst the wilderness could offer and had emerged unbroken. Her daughter Hope married a rancher from the Gallatin Valley and raised 6 children of her own, passing down the story of her birth along with the family Bible and her grandmother's quilts. The tale grew with each telling, becoming part of the oral tradition of the frontier, a reminder that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when the stakes were high enough. Some storms break us, bending our spirits until they snap like green wood in the wind. But the strongest among us learn to bend without breaking, to find shelter in our own hearts when the world offers none. Sarah Mitchell had become that kind of shelter, and her daughter would carry that strength forward into a world that would test her in ways her mother could never imagine. But that is a story for another winter night when the wind howls across the Montana peaks and the snow piles deep against the windows, and brave souls gather around the fire to remember those who came before, the mothers and fathers who carved civilization from the wilderness, one small act of courage at a time. The legacy lives on in every child born to face an uncertain world, in every mother who fights against impossible odds, in every person who refuses to surrender hope even in the darkest hour. Sarah's story reminds us that love, particularly a mother's love, can be the strongest force in nature, capable of moving mountains or surviving storms that would destroy anything less pure and determined. And in that cold Montana valley where it all began, the wind still carries whispers of that long Ago night, reminders that heroes aren't always soldiers or explorers or famous figures from history books. Sometimes they're just ordinary people who find extraordinary strength when they need it most, who become larger than themselves when someone they love depends on their courage. Hope Mitchell grew up to embody everything her name promised, and her children would carry forward the knowledge that they came from stock, tough enough to survive anything the world could throw at them. The story of her birth remained alive in family memory, a touchstone of strength they could draw on whenever life seemed impossible. Because in the end, that is what stories like this one are really about. Not just survival, but the triumph of the human spirit over circumstances that should have destroyed it. They remind us that we're capable of more than we know, that love can make us stronger than we ever imagined possible. And sometimes, on the coldest nights, when the storm seems strongest, that knowledge is enough to keep the wolves at bay and the fire burning bright enough to last until dawn.